Welcome back to the Bitcoin Layer. I'm Nick Bhatia. Today we welcome back PhD economist Peter St. Onge. Peter, great to see you.
Great to be back, Nick.
All right, let's talk about, can Doge save the dollar? That's one of the things that I know you have an event coming up with Unchained. What is the thesis here on the dollar and what Doge can do for the dollar and what it can't do for the dollar?
Right. So paper money has been a major driver in the growth in government ever since 1913, right? So you had the income tax come in at the same time as the Federal Reserve come in. And something like half of the growth in government has been down to their ability to print unlimited money. Now, when I say something like, there's a big caveat there, which is that effectively the Federal Reserve is the venture capitalist of crisis. Right, and crisis can include wars. It can include make-believe crises like global warming. It can include respiratory illnesses. And the key here is that, but because the Fed has this limitless money printer, it can print enough money. In other words, it can finance deficits to the point that any new crisis, even a voluntary one, like say taking over Afghanistan for 20 years, these crises become fiscally neutral to voters. Right. So if you sat voters down at the beginning of Afghanistan, you say, hey, I got an idea. We're gonna run Afghanistan, this medieval tribal country, for the next 20 years, and it's only going to cost you $3 trillion. Right. So that's like $25,000 per household in America. So if you actually told people, so I'm going to need a $25,000 check from you. No Christmas presents this year. You have to sell the second car. You guys can carpool. That's not going to work, right? Similarly, if in early COVID, if you sort of ran a mental experiment, so imagine when they talked about shutting down the entire economy, if you abstract from all of the stimmies and the PPP and the benefits they handed out, they shut down something like half, about 40 or 50% of GDP was considered non-essential early on. Now, if you imagine a government meeting where you've got some junior bureaucrat in there, he says, okay, I got a great idea. Because we have this bad flu running around, we are going to shut down the entire economy. Yes, that's going to, constrict tax revenue. Okay, that's going to drop in half, but that's okay because we can just lay off all the government workers, right? So he would have a very, very short career in government. They would exile him to Guam to become assistant dog catcher. Moral of the story being that the money printing, not only year in, year out, does that expand the government. When you expand the government, it expands its powers. Every new bureaucrat you hire, they create new rules, they create restrictions, they censor your speech. Not only does that happen year in, year out, but on top of that, you could argue that every crisis, including World War I and its sequel, World War II, were caused by the money printers. So what we're doing in this event with Unchained is walking through some of the history of that and how hard money fixes it, and very specifically how Bitcoin fixes it, right? Because historically, when we have run into trouble, into sort of fiscal Armageddon, gold has stepped in to save the day. And of course, Bitcoin didn't exist up until, 2008. So at this point, I think it's an interesting question. Number one, what are the dynamics on fiat? Is fiat going to die? When? Number two, what is fiat doing to our world, right? It expands our government. It's the cause of a lot of the things that DOGE is currently fighting. And number three, when that day comes, either because we get a crisis or because we get enough awareness among voters of what inflationary fiat currency is doing, when we fix that, what does the world look like?
And so when we talk about when fiat dies, that's something that I know you and I probably don't have the same exact take on. I believe that the credit system is emergent and will continue on, and that Bitcoin presents the perfect alternative to storing your wealth inside the fiat system. So do you think that it's going to die, and when? What's your outlook there?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that in the near term, most of the benefit of Bitcoin is a lifeboat that you can protect yourself, even though the system itself is getting worse. Either it's getting worse gradually or rapidly. The historical lifespan of paper money is somewhere around 50 years, I think. And, of course, there's a couple caveats there. One of them is that we've never had a worldwide system where every single currency in the world was fiat. And nowadays we do. We've had some, there's a little bit of backing on the Swiss franc and things like that. But functionally, this is the first time. And the reason that matters is that the closest competitors to the current system, you don't have another gold-backed currency in Saudi Arabia or something that can act as an alternative. You've had to go to gold, and now that Bitcoin exists, Bitcoin is the alternative. But there are a number of caveats there, right? They're much more volatile. They're harder to handle. They're not fully integrated into the banking system. So given all that, I know that it's popular to talk about the 50-year lifespan on fiat currency, and then you do the math, whether you start the clock at FDR or Nixon, time's up. And I think that things are different this time because of that global oligarchy of paper money. And so I do think that it's going to take quite a while. There's a quote by Adam Smith where some junior bureaucrat was talking about, some tariff, actually, I think it was, ironically. And his response was, he was afraid this would destroy Britain. And Adam Smith said, "My dear boy, there's a lot of ruin in a nation," meaning that you can have catastrophic policies. They're catastrophic on paper. They may be catastrophic. But the thing is, people adjust to them. So companies adjust, individuals adjust, even governments adjust. At some point, especially when you have a democracy, they're afraid of getting voted out of power. So we've seen, for example, in Canada or Germany, you've had different moments where countries have sort of straightened out and fixed their budget deficits. It doesn't last. But the point is that it's not like a straight line extrapolation from here to Armageddon. There's a lot of responses to it. And that fiat oligarchy, I think, extends the timeline. So I would be very surprised if fiat collapsed in the next, say, 20 years.
Okay, great. So let's talk about tariffs. It's something that I want to try to break down for people so that we start at the basics, right? There's a lot of, I'll let you respond to this before because I want to talk about trade deficits. But let's talk about whether you believe or not that the tariffs are meant to, quote unquote, bring manufacturing jobs back to America, or is it something else, or is it a combination? Let's start there because the narrative from the administration on the surface seems like, oh, we want to bring jobs back. But underneath the surface, it seems much wider ranging. So let's start with that by itself.
Yeah, so I think what makes Trump somewhat unique is that when he promises something, he feels compelled to fulfill that promise. So in the administration, they have a long list of things that Trump has promised, which is a lot of things, like hundreds of things. He just sort of flippantly puts out a promise out there. And they really, really want to tick those boxes. And so there are two. Trump feels that he's promised to bring jobs back for the working class, good paying jobs, for the working class, and to repair some of the damage that's happened to the Rust Belt. So to bring those jobs back, there's two ways to do that. One of them is to expand exports, and the other is to replace imports. Now, the difference is that it takes a long time to replace imports, right? So depending on the industry you're talking about, if you're talking about textiles, that's sort of the entry-level industry. Countries like Bangladesh will, start out in textiles and then sort of move up the food chain. Even a textile company, it's going to take you absolute minimum a year to stand that up. You've got to find the site, you got to get the permits, you got to hire the people, which is you got to find 1,000 people in Peoria or something. You're not going to start that until you know what tariffs are going to be in the future, right? So if every morning Trump wakes up and announces some deal, deals on, deals off, you as a business person, you're not going to do it because for all you know, the tariffs are going to come off, say, Vietnam in 3 months, and then they're going to flood the market with cheap product, and then you're going to go out of business. So it's going to take a long time to replace. We can do a little bit of expansion. So I think industrial production in the country is something, or industrial, the utilization.
Capacity utilization.
Bingo. So that's about 80%. So you can expand some exports. Obviously, agricultural products, there's a lot of room there. But in terms of wholesale replacing other countries in the supply chain, even if that's possible, which it is if you make tax reform and regulatory reform, it is possible, but it takes a long time. And I think the trick with Trump is that fundamentally, he likes to deal. He's the art of the deal guy. And part of that is that when you're having a negotiation like this, you want the other side to think that you're enjoying this. Okay. If China thinks that this is really hurting Trump, right? China looks at the stock market, sees 3,000 point falls. If they think that that's hurting Trump, then obviously they're just going to wait him out. So tactically, it's smart for Trump to say, look, I'm in this for the long haul. I love tariffs, the most beautiful word in the English language. The stock market's a bunch of rich guys. That's fine. It'll sort out. So tactically, he's got to say all these things. Then we have to sort of read between the lines to see what's real here. So boiling it out, I think Trump absolutely is open to making deals. He praised recently a phone call with Korea. Korea is begging for mercy. They want to zero out tariffs on both sides. He's hoping for a call from China. China has been talking big. They said we will fight to the end. But that was not President Xi talking. That was a relatively junior bureaucrat talking. So China is still open to negotiating. I think Trump is open to the art of the deal. But in his mind, the sort of payoff for him is bringing jobs back to the Rust Belt. That can be expanding exports. It can be replacing imports.
And so let's now go to the trade deficit. So I think aside from the jobs aspect of it, obviously they're very related, as you mentioned. The trade deficit is a function of your imports and your exports, of course. So the trade deficit that the United States has with other countries year after year, let's talk about why that is bad for the country from the perspective of the current administration. Why is, just so that people can understand the economics of it, why is a trade deficit perennially bad?
So when you have a trade deficit, you're functionally exporting your low-end jobs. Well, you're exporting jobs. In the U.S. case, empirically, we've been exporting low-end jobs. So the trade deals that the U.S. has generally cut have disadvantaged farming and manufacturing. So we've traded them down the river in exchange for concessions on primarily finance, pharmaceutical, Hollywood. So IP, intellectual protection, tends to be the theme of these trade agreements. And remember, when we talk about a free trade agreement, so in the Constitution, it's mandated that we have free trade between the states, and that's a clause. That's not even a full sentence. On the other hand, these free trade agreements, like with Korea, I mean, they're running like 1,000 pages. If you have 1,000-page free trade agreement, like, why not just write one sentence? We will not discriminate by country of origin. Why is it not one sentence? Because that's empirically what's happening in these, is that they're horse trading. And if you take Korea or Japan, for example, domestic farmers are extremely powerful in those countries. They make up the base of the conservative ruling party. Well, they're generally ruling. Korea had some drama with their president. So they cannot give those up in a so-called free trade deal. On the other hand, their manufacturing industries, those are also powerful. So what they tend to do is they'll negotiate with the U.S. where they say, okay, give us free access to your markets for manufacturers. We don't want your manufacturers. We don't want your farm products, but we're happy to let your banks, your pharmaceuticals, U.S. pharmaceuticals are basically world beating. We're happy to let Hollywood in. So they allow IT. All right, that's another area where the U.S. tends to use trade agreements to get concessions, to gain access to markets. So what we've done with these trade deals is that on the one hand, we've sold out relatively blue-collar industries, right, farming and manufacturing, in exchange for privileging kind of white-collar, high-end industries. So the people who work in pharma in the U.S. or in IT obviously are making a lot more money than the victims of this process, which are the blue collars. Now, meantime, you've got a second dynamic here, which is it's more domestic than anything else. But politicians in the U.S. have preyed on manufacturing. Danielle Lacalle called it using manufacturing as an ATM. So if you take Detroit, for example, you had people come into city government who said, well, look at all these factories, these big, beautiful factories. They're not going anywhere, so let's squeeze them. And they did that across the country. Unions also joined in. Specifically unemployment insurance, right? So you get money if you get laid off. That was specifically intended to give unions leverage to run strikes to the point where they could chase companies out of business. Both of those together just decimated U.S. manufacturing. You add on top of that regulations, where there's an entire industry in Washington that comes up with regulations. There was a study by the Mercatus Center that found that one single regulator destroys 138 jobs because of the massive impact. If you mandate that small restaurants have to buy a $20,000 air scrubber, well, what's going to happen? The mom and pops are going to go out of business. The end result is that you drive around to small towns in America, you see a Burger King, you see a gas station, and nothing else. The small businesses are wiped out. So you put it together, and essentially our domestic politicians have shot us in the foot, and now we go and rent wheelchairs from China, and people are upset about it. So the solution is, number one, what Trump has been pushing, which is massive cuts in red tape, lower business taxes. He's been talking about a made in America tax break. Of course, almost every company in the U.S. Makes things that are made in America, especially services. So he's been, fixing it on that front, and then meanwhile addressing the other front, which is these uneven trade agreements.
Okay, great. So now that we have a setup for why trade deficits are bad or how they developed specifically with the horse trading, as you mentioned, now let's talk about the tariffs themselves. So talk about the economics of tariffs. Why are tariffs by themselves economically bad, but being applied in this situation are being applied in a statecraft sort of way where there is an intention for them? It's not just to put up trade barriers, there is an agenda behind it. So help the viewer understand how tariffs address this issue from the beginning.
Yeah, so if you zoom out, tariffs are not a good thing on their own. They are basically sales taxes. They're discriminatory sales taxes. They're not great on their own. Free trade itself is a wonderful thing. Like, for example, if you live in the state of Delaware and you can't buy phones from, a California company like Apple, you have to buy the domestic Delaware version, it would be pretty rough. So free trade is grand. Tariffs are a problem. Ideally, you would have a world that has zero tariffs anywhere, and you could just import, export all over. All right. But having said, there are two reasons why I'm okay with Trump's tariffs. And one of them is the negotiating power. So large countries, historically, through thousands of years of history, get to push around small countries. Whether or not this is a good thing, the point is that Donald Trump happens to work for the voters of a big country. The U.S. has enormous negotiating heft. When you add on top of that the unpaid mercenary services that we provide to Europe, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, it is astounding that we're the ones who get shafted on these trade deals. Trump is willing to use our power. The U.S. makes up about 1/4 of the global economy. We are a very substantial part of the world. Because we run these trade deficits, other countries need us a lot more than we need them. So to illustrate, as a percent of GDP, Europe exports about 3 times more to us than we do to them. For China, it's about 4 times more. For Canada, it's about 10 times more. For Mexico, it's about 15 times more. Right? We are 1/3 of the Mexican economy is producing stuff to ship to the U.S. For us, it's something like 1.2%. So the point being that there is enormous negotiating power that the U.S. has, even without getting into the military. We could just call Japan and say, hey, we could bring our boys home. So I used to live in Taiwan, and it was shocking to me. So Taiwan only exists due to the generosity of the American people. And yet living there as an American, I had to pay through the nose for my visa, and, I couldn't buy American beef. It was blocked. All these products are blocked. That's an absurd state of affairs. So I think it's grand that Trump is monetizing some of that power that the U.S. has. Really, what should be happening is the opposite, right? Because we are so generous to them, we should be the ones who have extra trade barriers while they are wide open. And then the other point is the prospect of bringing manufacturing back. Whether or not it takes 10 years, to bring some industries back, whether or not we can ever bring, say, sneakers back to America, the point is that in order to reindustrialize America, if you need to slash red tape and you need to lower business taxes, especially on small businesses and startups, which get hit hardest by regulations, if you need to do that to make America into a more attractive place to produce, I am okay, even if that doesn't work, right? We will have fertilized our fields, and then whatever grows there, grows there. In other words, we can create a lot more jobs in this country using the tariffs as a domestic club to get rid of the anti-business policies that we have.
Now, talk about Europe, okay? Let's focus on Europe. I think that there's a much bigger picture. You mentioned NATO. There's a much bigger picture thing going on with Europe. Obviously, the European banks have been put on watch that they might not have access to swap lines in a crisis. This is this is pinpointed financial warfare. It's crazy to think about that the US is positioning themselves to potentially cut off the eurodollar system from liquidity. Then you layer in on the tariffs. I've been thinking about this a lot. What is your take on how USA and Europe, you can mention Macron, you can anything that you're thinking of there. I'm really curious what you could put on your tinfoil hat. I want to hear your thoughts on Europe.
So I think that, Trump has come out and said it. One of the beautiful things about Trump is that he just says what he thinks. I think in negotiations, sometimes he'll play it close to his chest, but in general, he says what he thinks. And he just came out last week saying that the European Union was set up to shaft America, which I think is accurate. The European community back in the 50s, that was set up to try to reduce war in Europe. European Union was specifically to be United States of Europe. He recognizes Europe for what it is, which is essentially a union against the US. And, the sort of zooming out, I think part of the issue here is that the global empire, I think, has not been helpful for the United States, right? So if you compare us to, let's say, Switzerland. So Switzerland has essentially the same access to every country in the world. Swiss goods can export everywhere. If a criminal commits a crime overseas, then they send them back to Switzerland. In other words, they have all of the normal relationships with every other country. What they don't have is these bizarre reverse tribute relationships, right? Normally in a tribute relationship, the weak country pays the strong country. The US somehow managed to set up a system where we pay everybody in the world. And this is not sustainable. I think it's something that the American people do not like. Currently, Democrats are supporting it, but I think that's more just because they're told to, because it's associated with Trump. Fundamentally, no country's voters are going to be real enthusiastic about the idea that you're just going to line countries up and just rain money on them. During the Iraq War, there was kind of a nice image where Iraq was getting these massive walls. The U.S. was building these massive walls around all these highways in Iraq so that they wouldn't get IEDs. But meanwhile, we ourselves couldn't have a wall, right? We had these little ramshackle, chicken wire fences down on the southern border. That is a world that is not sustainable for voters. So I think that, in terms of what's the future of U.S. Europe, are we going to sell out our allies? Well, they're not really our allies. We give them tribute. We do this to Japan. We do this to Europe. I think that a lot of Trump's voters, every so often I run a poll on it, basically asking, should we fix NATO or should we walk away? People are done with it. To heck with Europe. Let them solve their own problems. They're still going to trade with us, just like everybody trades with Switzerland. But Uncle Sugar will be going home.
It's fascinating to think about it. I want to unpack this sentence. Europe is a union against the United States. What does that mean, Peter?
So Europe felt that it was getting the short end of negotiations because you would have tiny little countries negotiating with the giant US, Denmark versus US. And so they had originally created the European community to, I think it was in steel and coal, and that was between France, Germany, and the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands. And the idea was to head off any future war. But once, this is around the 80s, when they started thinking that, we could use this for something bigger, which is that we could join our power together and have heavier negotiating heft with the US. And of course, this is true. The EU economy is nearly the size of the US economy. The population is greater. And that gives it the ability to do things like dictating standards, for example, so they can write worldwide standards in a way that benefits European companies. They have used it to regulate tech companies. They're trying to hit Elon with $1 billion, but generally they're trying to hit tech companies to advantage domestic champions in Europe. So it is working for them. And I think it's maybe the most striking aspect of it is, how did this not occur to other US presidents? Like, were they on the take? Were they like, where was the money flowing that it never occurred to anybody that maybe we actually have a confrontational relationship with the EU and need to play a little bit more hardball with them?
Now let's talk about China. What is the path forward? Because is China going to come to the table? Does it matter? Are we in an escalating trade war with China going on 10 years? Is that the main picture? What is the risk, the downside risk for the world if China has to devalue, if they escalate the trade war? Can you game theory the China situation for us? I'm calling
Yeah,
these the different theaters of war here.
right. Yeah, so China's interesting because it is so dominant in manufacturing. There are a lot of products that more or less are only made in China. And that's what gives China the confidence right now to be so aggressive with Trump. I think the interesting sort of game theory dynamic here is that if Trump is trying to make deals with other countries, say Vietnam, Korea, Mexico, well, all of those countries directly compete with China, right? They do on different sort of points on the value chain, they do exactly what China does. So every country that Trump makes friends with means that it's not just China versus the US, it's the US plus Vietnam plus Korea plus Mexico, all coming to take China's lunch. And the background here is that China censors a lot of domestic unrest, but there's something like 1,000 riots per year in China. This has been longstanding. They had one situation where the bank shut down, people came to get their deposits, and the local military commander drove the tanks around the bank just, as a regular exercise, right? So, I mean, you've got the Chinese people are a lot more bolshy than I think people understand. Also, the leadership in China, they came of age during the Cultural Revolution when government bureaucrats were thrown out windows. The Chinese people have historically been a lot more kinetic than the American people. And I think that the Chinese leadership is afraid of them. And so to say that, in the short term, China is probably going to do what it did during Trump's first term, which is to hand out buckets of money to Chinese exporters to float them so they don't have to lay off people. But if the trade war keeps escalating, if Trump keeps making a separate peace with Vietnam and Mexico and Korea, then at some point, China is going to be in real trouble. They're going to have mass layoffs. They're going to have people in the street. So the fundamental question is, can China hold out longer than Trump can hold out? And, the background there is that I personally think that Trump's only got about a year to a year and a half that he can actually hold out on a trade war because of the midterms. So if stocks are still in the gutter, if, tariff or if inflation or supply chains are still disrupted because of the tariffs come mid-26, Trump is not going to risk a midterm loss, because if he does, he loses Congress, plus he gets to spend the next 2 years in endless lawfare with congressional committees on every last thing. Remember what they did with this Signal chat when they had the wrong guy in the Signal chat, and that the Democrats want to hold hearings and lawsuits. So Trump does not want that. So I think realistically, Trump is talking as if he wants the trade war to go on forever. I think he's only got about a year and a half. The question is, does China have longer than that?
Now, let's talk about the tariffs coming into effect. What is your expectation in terms of the rest of the world just waiving tariffs left and right? We already see hints of that. Is that your base case expectation? And is that what you're expecting to put the pressure on China?
Yeah, waiving tariffs meaning like zero for zero deals where they drop all their tariffs and we drop all ours. I think that's most likely what's going to happen with most countries. People, for some reason, people think of countries as like gentlemen and friends and allies and whatnot. Countries are psychopaths. Countries have one job, which is to benefit their own people, and they will sell out everybody else at the drop of a hat. So, we're already seeing, let's see, India, Israel, Korea, Vietnam, even the EU has floated zero for zero tariffs. I think absolutely the vast majority of countries are going to come to the table. That's going to be putting pressure on China. which, if I had to guess, China is going to be the last holdout, just because China feels that it has negotiating leverage because of its dominance in manufacturing, the size of its economy. Plus, China's not used to hearing the word no. I think this is something new for them. So I expect that China is going to be the last man out, in which case that would be suicidal for the Chinese economy. Remember, the Chinese economy is not doing that hot. Growth looks to be around 2% using shadow statistics. The government, the official statistics, nobody believes them. Shadow statistics are about 2%. Even the official statistics, under President Xi, he's been in for, 8 or 12 years or something. Under Xi, growth has only been about 5%. It has not been double digits for a very long time in China. Like, people our generation think that China is this miracle economy. It's not. 5% is pretty miserable for a country that's that poor. That's pretty typical. That's probably below Bangladesh or Ethiopia. So the Chinese miracle is already running on fumes. I am not sure that China can hold out as long as people expect.
Peter, who should we be reading on China? It's one of the toughest places to access good information and good economic research. So I'm curious where we should be going.
Yeah, one of the best resources is Leland Miller, China Beige Book, and they specifically use shadow statistics to try to estimate. So things like cement imports, right, which are a proxy for investment and for housing construction. So they have a whole range of shadow statistics specifically because you can't really believe the official numbers. And China is, of course, one of the most important economies in the world.
Last thing before I want to ask you about the event, deregulation. You mentioned it a lot of times and how important it is. When is it coming? How big can it be? Who are you reading or looking for from the administration on deregulation? I haven't heard that many specifics on how wide they're going to slash, or are they going to go department by department? What is your thought there?
Yeah, I think they are. They're going as wide as they can. Some of this is pairing up with DOGE, which is the idea that if you get rid of a regulation, then you've made a bunch of people redundant and you have an excuse to get rid of them. There was a interesting Supreme Court case last year called Loper v. Bright. Loper Bright v. Raimondo, sorry.
The Chevron case.
Yep. Right. It involved so-called Chevron deference. And the decision there essentially said that if a rule is not passed by Congress, then if it's a major question, in other words, if it involves a lot of money or has a big economic impact, it is void. And something like 90 or 95% of the rules that we live under, and remember, rules have the force of law. So a rule effectively is the same as a law when you're a company. And something like 90 or 95% of those were not passed by Congress. They were hatched out of the deep state bureaucrats. So Loper Bright essentially said all of these are void. And so they're just waiting for either lawsuits to be launched against them. West Virginia v. EPA was a big one recently, which reduced some environmental regulations. And then the other part of that is coming from within the administration. So either it's coming from DOGE or it's coming from deregulatory efforts by the administration. So in Trump's first term, he cut something like 8 regulations for every one new one that came in. He's targeting bigger numbers on that. I think DOGE is driving it even harder, and that Loper Bright is giving it all staying power. The irony here is that when Loper Bright passed, there were a lot of people who were very excited about getting rid of the administrative state. And there was almost no deregulation under Joe Biden, of course, because his handlers quite liked the deep state. So in other words, he was disobeying the will of the Supreme Court. It was a rogue presidency. But Trump seems very enthusiastic about removing those. Now, in terms of which specific regulations, when we're talking about manufacturing, about 2/3 of the regulatory hit is environmental stuff. And I mean, it's just endless. Scrubbers on, if you're like a small restaurant, you've got about 5 different rules on, and a lot of them involve very expensive equipment that you have to buy. So it drives people out of business. So a lot of those rules, either relaxing the enforcement of them, in other words, only if there's some case where it's egregious, like somebody's harmed, or just getting rid of the rule altogether. They've talked about SEC. The SEC has been famously on the warpath, certainly against crypto. It hasn't been aggressive against Bitcoin as an asset, but it has been in terms of financial integration of Bitcoin. So I think between DOGE, the administration, and that Supreme Court decision, I think that we're going to see pretty massive deregulation. That alone will be a big help for business. And then, the sort of next piece of the puzzle that needs to come into place to really reindustrialize America is going to be tax cuts. there, sadly, he's going to need Congress to do something. Congress so far has been pretty pathetic.
Okay, so piece by piece on the deregulatory front, not necessarily legislated. Tax cuts definitely need to be legislated, and we'll be watching for all that. Peter, thank you so much for giving us this overview. Tell people about the online event with Unchained.
Yeah, so this is happening on the 16th at noon, and I'm going to be talking about sort of DOGE for the dollar, so talking about how Bitcoin and hard money can change our future and what the prospects are. So I hope you will tune in. Check it out at unchained.com.
Yep, unchained.com/TBL for all that information. Peter St. Onge, thank you so much. We'll catch you guys next time.